This is More Money with economist Steve Moore. Now, Steve Moore.
Welcome back, folks. This is the More Money Show on WABC Talk Radio. Thanks so much for joining on this beautiful Saturday afternoon all along the East Coast. These are the dog days of summer, a nice time to relax, but also to listen to the radio and hear some of the best guests that you can find. And you can find them on the More Money Show. We're on every Saturday afternoon from 1 to 3 p.m. And I know we have affiliates, people listening online all over the country. My next guest is Brian Demidrovich. And Brian has been a longtime friend. He is a scholar of the truest kind. He is one of the, I would say, the top economic historians in the country. He's written a lot about what happens when you change tax policy, when you change economic policy. He's rewritten a lot of the economic history because, as I said earlier at the start of the show, a lot of what you read by the historians about, who did it right and who did it wrong is all wrong. And so, Brian Demidrovich, thanks so much for joining today.
I'm really happy to talk to you, Steve.
So Brian is also the Richard Strong Fellow at the Laffer Institute in Nashville, Tennessee. And as you all know, I have Arthur Laffer on the show all the time. But I wanted to get Brian on today because, Brian, I wanted to talk about a couple of your fantastic books. One of them was called The Iconoclast, which was about the supply side tax cutting revolution of the late 70s and 80s and the key figures in that. And of course, you have another great book out that just came out not so long ago that is about tax policy over the last 100 years. It's called Taxes Have Consequences. And you co-authored that book with Arthur Laffer. But let's start with the Iconoclast, because these are people who really changed the world and basically said, held up their hands and said to the politicians, you're going in the wrong direction. You got to stop spending so much money and cutting taxes and reducing regulation and letting the free enterprise system work. Tell me and my audience, Brian, who were some of the superstars of that movement?
Sure. Yeah, back in the 70s, after Nixon went off the gold standard and the highly progressive income tax structure with rates up to 70% got exposed by the inflation, because the tax code was unindexed for inflation at that time.
Right.
All sorts of young, potentially influential, really talented people just came to the fore and said this has to stop. I'd say the initial big three were certainly Robert Mundell at the University of Chicago, and then his associate, Arthur Laffer, also a professor at the University of Chicago. And then they were joined by Jude Wanniski, who worked for Dow Jones in 1971. And it was Jude Wanniski who brought in Bob Bartley, who was the editor, who became the editor of the Wall Street Journal. And then on the legislative side, they had Jack Kemp beginning around 1976. And I'd say those people.
And then, of course, they were able to persuade Ronald Reagan in the late 70s that this was the right program, and history changed in an enormous way. So, Brian, at the time, tax cutting was not in vogue, right? And people didn't really understand the negative consequences of taxes. Arthur Laffer taught us that, when you have very high tax rates, you diminish the incentive to work and invest and to save and start businesses. And he was pretty much proven correct. And then, of course, you mentioned Jude Wanniski. He's the one who kind of popularized almost every day on the Wall Street Journal editorial pages what Arthur Laffer was saying.
Yeah, it was kind of a funny time back, at least before the stagflation of the 70s. I mean, the marginal rate of the income tax in the United States was 70%, 7-0, after John F. Kennedy cut it from 91% in 1964. And yet somehow there was post-war prosperity, but it's really because, number one, there was no inflation, so people weren't just pushed into higher tax brackets every year. Number two, the tax rates really were inapplicable in that the total tax take was 16% of GDP, and yet the first tax rate before Kennedy cut it was 20% of GDP all the way up to 91. So there were so many exemptions and deductions and loopholes that particularly business took advantage of. We never really realized how high tax rates were until inflation made the point inescapable in the 70s.
Right. Because you couldn't get around the inflation, and inflation is a tax in and of itself, and people were being pushed into higher and higher tax brackets, right?
Yeah, and then on the business side, that's exactly what happened. On the business side, it's just, the left sits here and tells us about, Reagan caused deindustrialization. Industrial production in the United States from 1980 to 2000 went up in real terms by 80%. So who knows what they're talking about? I know when it happened. It happened in the 1970s because the profits tax, which was the corporate profits tax, was 48% in the 1970s. And corporate revenues just morphed into profits because they had to deduct their equipment purchases over a 10-year schedule at nominal prices. So if you bought a big piece of equipment in 1967, it was worth one-third in 1977 because of the hyperinflation, and yet you could only deduct the nominal costs. And so your receipts were literally morphing themselves into profits on the tax code, and you just simply cannot operate as an industrial business in that fashion.
So one thing I love about your book, your more recent book, which people should read, it's a great book of the history of basically taxation in the United States, is the book Taxes Have Consequences. And, as I read the book, there were three great periods. Well, I'm going to say four great periods of tax rate reduction. One was in the 1920s under Calvin Coolidge. And then you had the same thing, as you mentioned, John F. Kennedy in the 60s, who cut the top rate from 90 to 70%. And then Reagan came in and did the same thing with the help of people like Jack Kemp. And then, of course, you had Donald Trump, who came in. And he, when Laffer and I would meet with Trump back then, he was very aware of what Reagan had done. He said, I want my own Reagan-style tax cut. And so we cut those business tax rates, which at that time were the highest in the world. But as I understand your book, virtually every time we cut these tax rates, the economy improved and the revenues went up.
It's true. Those are four great examples. And if you look at any extended, sharp period of growth in American history since the arrival of the income tax in 1913, you will find that exact correspondence. That's when growth shoots up to 4, 5, 6% per year for an extended term. I'm going to mention even a fifth tax cut, which ended up, I think, after we wrote the book, my favorite tax cut, which was that of 1948. This is when the tax code barreling into peacetime in 1945 had top rates at 94%. Congress put through a big tax cut. 3 times Truman vetoed it. And the states said to the federal government, we are going to switch our legal traditions from common law to community property unless you let the husband and wife divide the one income into two so that you will effectively cut tax rates by a third. And Truman's veto was overridden on the third chance in 1948.
I didn't know that.
And you look at government spending fell by 75%.
I know it did, yeah.
And from 45 to 46. And then into that, you have this massive tax cut. Look at the real growth numbers in 46, 47, 48. They're incredible, 6% per year. So virtually all the growth.
And by the way, at that time, all the economists were saying we were going to have a Great Depression because of the government spending falling so much. But by cutting taxes, we actually inspired growth. And so the government spending went away and then the private sector took over, right?
I used to see what Paul Samuelson wrote about it at the time. He was a young economist. He said, we'll need 100 TVAs in order to avoid a Great Depression. Henry Wallace, who was running for president as this left-winger, said, we have to create 60 million new jobs through government programs. They were all wrong.
Yeah, they sure were. And it's amazing that these people are still revered oftentimes. Paul Samuelson then went on to write the textbook that, millions and millions of us used on Economics 100. And this was the guy who, in many, he was a great economist in many ways, but a lot of his policy advice was so wrong, and it really infected the minds of young people. Now, what about Trump? Trump cut the rate on the corporate rate. He also allowed immediate expensing, and that's had a pretty positive effect on the revenues and the growth.
Yeah, President Trump did exactly what one of the classical supply-siders did. Robert L. Bartley, the classic editor of the Wall Street Journal in the supply-side years, he boiled it down to a simple formula. He said, look, okay, here's the essence of supply-side tax policy. You find the highest marginal tax rates and you cut them. Yes. And that is exactly what Donald Trump did.
Yep,
differentially across the world, the highest rate in the United States was its corporate rate. He found that rate and he cut it. And the expensing was part of that as well. So it was kind of a perfect expression of supply-side policy.
It sure is. And you're right. That's exactly what he did. I was in the room with Art Laffer when he looked at these charts and looked at the high rates. And I'll tell you, you and my audience, this quick story that I showed Donald Trump this chart that had the U.S. business corporate tax rate, and then all these other countries, as you know, Brian, had been very aggressively cutting their business rates, even the Europeans, dramatically reducing their tax rates. So it got to the point where the divide between what our tax rate was and the rest of the world was very substantial. And they kept doing this because they were trying to steal our jobs by providing an incentive for companies to move out. And when Trump saw this, he just said, well, this is like a Head Start program for every country we're competing with. And I just laughed and I said, boy, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, and the great thing about it is it makes everyone better. Somebody else wants to become more competitive by getting more lean and mean. Well, then you start training some more. I'm going to get more lean and mean. And it was a perfect response, and now everyone's better because of it.
Yeah. But now, Brian, I'm talking to Brian Demidrovich, who is the author of many books, but two of really outstanding books that I love are The Iconoclast, which is the story of the supply-side tax-cutting revolution of the 70s and 80s, and then more recently, a great book that's co-authored with Arthur Laffer called Taxes Have Consequences. And now I'm going to play the devil's advocate. May I?
Please do.
Okay. The 1950s. Everybody said the 1950s was the golden age for the American economy, and we had 80% tax rates. So tax rates don't matter.
Yeah, sure. Well, the numbers say a little different. The growth rate in the 1960s, from 61 to 69, 8-year run of uninterrupted growth was 5%, 5.0. And in the Eisenhower presidency, 8 years before that, 53 to 61, it was 2.5. So Kennedy said, in the campaign in 1960, I want to double the rate of growth because it was an issue. Nixon himself, who was running for president as Eisenhower's VP, conceded growth is an issue. My official policy is a growth rate of 5% doubled. So people at the time understood there had been 3 recessions in the Eisenhower presidency under a tax rate at the top that was cut from 92 all the way down to 91%.
Wow.
So, because those tax rates largely didn't apply because of all the loopholes, there was some movement in the economy, 2.5% per year, but nothing befitting post-war prosperity. We got that when we committed to tax cuts in the 60s.
Right. So that's an amazing story. And I think people need to know about this because, Trump is now saying he wants to cut tax rates some more. He wants to keep the Trump tax cut permanent, which is going to be a big issue in this race because Kamala Harris, Brian, has come out and said, I'm going to repeal the whole Trump tax cut. Well, if your book is right, that will have negative consequences.
Yeah, I don't know the jurisprudence that well, but so far as I understand, she needs a vote to change the corporate rate back to the old rate. Yes. But the other personal side and maybe the expensing will go unless Congress takes action. That's not a good idea. We know what happens when the United States, blew cold on tax rate cuts in the 50s. You had mediocre growth. And we had a large debt back then, didn't make significant progress on it. Richard Nixon raised the capital gains rate.
I know.
Right as inflation was about to start in 1969, it killed the startup industry that then roared back under Reagan. Yeah. I don't know why the Democrats don't run on a Bill Clinton-style economy. Heck, Hillary didn't even run on the 1990s.
I know. Yeah.
And that should be their soul.
Yeah, we had great growth under Clinton. We balanced the budget under Clinton. He cut the capital gains tax and, did free trade deals and was in many ways a very pro-economic growth centrist Democrat. I wish, Brian, that still exists today, but I'm not so sure it does. And when you look at Kamala, who's to the left of Bernie Sanders, that makes me shudder. Folks, Brian Dimitrovich's great book is Taxes Have Consequence. Brian, thanks for taking time in your busy day on this beautiful Saturday afternoon. Folks, we'll be right back. This is the More Money Show on WABC.
All of Red Apple Media's podcasts right now through your favorite podcast platform. It's More Money with leading economist Steve Moore. Now, here's your host, Steve Moore.
Welcome back, folks. This is the More Money Show on WABC Talk Radio. I hope you're all having a wonderful Saturday afternoon in these dog days of summer. Hope you're getting out and relaxing, and I hope you've got your radio on and keep listening to the show because we have an excellent guest coming up in my good friend Tom Del Beccaro, who is an author. He was the head of the Republican Party in California. Think about that being a thankless job. He also was reminding me, and I had forgotten about this, his many exploits. Tom Del Beccaro also ran against Kamala Harris for the United States Senate in 2016, and he beat Kamala Harris in that debate soundly, but he sadly, because it was California, he lost the race. So I definitely want to talk to Tom about what you would recommend, Tom, in terms of how do you beat Kamala Harris and what's the best way to find her vulnerabilities. His new book, which is out, I believe Tom told me off air that it comes out next Tuesday. It is going to be, I think, a bestseller. It's called The Lessons of the American Civilization, The Lessons of the American Civilization. It's really a celebration of this great, great country of ours. And you're not going to find that in most history books. Tom Del Beccaro, thank you for joining.
Steve, great to be on. So much to chat about, including Kamala Harris, and thanks so much for mentioning the book.
Well, okay, let's just get right into it then. Let's talk about Kamala, and then we'll talk about your book because she is the lady of the day of the week. She's going through a bit of a honeymoon period, at least with the media, who is just fawning all over this woman. She's narrowed the Trump lead. I think she'll be formidable. I really do. I don't agree with the things she says, but she seems to be rallying the party around her. You debated her, you campaigned against her, you've seen her. I mean, tell us about, most Americans don't know a lot about Kamala Harris.
Well, she's had a gilded life. And what I mean by that is she has not really earned her place in any of these particular stations in life that she's reached, nor has she accomplished much within it. I don't mean to be so direct and harsh, but it's the truth. She became DA of San Francisco because Willie Brown got her there. He cleared the field for her, and she became Attorney General. And when she was there, she was known as the photo op Attorney General. She didn't really manage that huge department in California, but she was there to take pictures. Then when she ran for U.S. Senate, the field was essentially cleared for her. And then she was in the Senate for just 2 years and did earn. At the end, she was the most liberal, but I got to tell you something about it, she is less of an ideologue than an opportunist. Yeah, and here's why I say that. Before determining she was going to run for president of the United States, she didn't have the most liberal record. But as you know, when you run in the Democrat Party, you have to run hard to the left and stand out among a crowd of would-be socialists. And then she promptly became the most liberal. So she's quite the opportunist.
Yeah, that's right. And by the way, talk about opportunity knocking. She's the vice president, and then the party realizes that they're stuck with a lemon. And so who else could they turn to but Kamala, since she was the next in the line? She certainly has a lot of luck on her side. Hey, by the way, has she ever had a real job?
Well, she did, Trump points out, failed the bar, and then she did work as an attorney, and then she went into the district attorney's office. So is that a real job?
I meant, has she ever actually run a business or anything like that? No. It sounds like the answer is no.
Nothing significant.
Yeah. So that's unfortunately a big problem in Washington, is none of these people, with the exception of Donald Trump when he was president, almost none of these people have any business experience, and they're telling us how to run a $7 trillion operation in Washington. So when you debated her, what was that like?
Well, I was kind of surprised at how little she did know. She doesn't think well on her feet. She's good with her opening line. Right. But that's memorized, right? Following up.
Yeah.
Yeah. So she practices an opening line. You saw that in her debate when Tulsi Gabbard hit her hard. She has an opening line, but she doesn't have a depth of knowledge. So flat out, she was asked a question I recall about, is there anything, or what's your judgment of Obama's policy in Syria, which was an issue back in April of 2016. And she could give no real response. And the Chronicle said, well, that's all very nice, but will you answer the question? And she couldn't do it. So what's happening in the campaign with her, Steve, is she's going to read off this script as you've been seeing, and she's avoiding press conferences because she doesn't have depth of knowledge and is slow on her feet.
Yeah. And so you hit her pretty hard in that debate. I called her out on her record. Yes.
So I would call her out on her record, and she, like, for instance, she was head of the AG's office that was investigating the guy who disclosed what Planned Parenthood was doing. So I said, you have a conflict of interest because you're cheerleading for the Planned Parenthood, even on the state website, and yet you're investigating some Planned Parenthood and whether or not they broke the law. I said, you should conflict of interest. You should step aside in that investigation. And her retort was, I will never back down from supporting a woman's right to choose.
Right. Well, that's kind of typical for her. She'll say that over and over again in the debate against Trump. So what is your advice to Donald Trump about, facing off, if you're facing off against a woman, the rules change a little bit in terms of politics. So how would you advise Donald Trump to deal with Kamala?
The first thing he should say to her is I want to congratulate you on your successes, becoming the first woman vice president. That's a testament to America today. Mm-hmm. However, I disagree with your policies. And tonight, I hope we all find out what those policies really are and the questions are asked. And then what he should do is he himself should ask the question. He should say to her, please tell us where you disagree with Joe Biden. Do you really, really want to have Medicare for all? Do you want to dispense with private health care? And watch her dissemble from there.
But she'll lie. She'll say, I'm not in favor of those things, even though we know she is.
Well, and what Trump needs to do between now and that first debate is to put out just her policy points. On social media started today I'm going through a list of 100 reasons. I give a reason a day. Today's reason today on number one, she wants to eliminate private health care.
Right.
People want private health care. Independents don't want government taking over. So her record defeats her, but you just have to do it plainly and get away from being too negative towards her or slandering her or however you want to describe it, because the record alone will defeat her.
Yeah. And I mean, what worries me, Tom, I think that's a wise strategy, but if I were preparing Kamala, I'd say, she knows that question is coming and she'll just say, well, I now believe that if you, under my plan, if you like your health insurance, the BS Obama line, if you like your health care, you can keep it, that kind of thing. And so she's not, they're not going to be stupid. They'll be prepared for these attacks. And unfortunately, the people on the left are not constrained by the truth like you and I are. So they will just say, oh, I'm not really for that. Or I'm not in favor of getting rid of cars. I'm not in favor of getting rid of air conditioning. I'm not in favor of the Green New Deal. She's going to run away from her record.
She will. I always tell my clients in a trial, if the other side lies, chalk it up because you're going to use that in closing argument by pointing to her position last month and her position now. But again, the main thing to realize is she's not good under pressure. She's not quick on her feet. And so the more questions that are asked to her, like a Joe Biden, she'll hem and haw and people will see that.
Yeah. I think you're right. I hope that Donald Trump gets together with you and you get to help him. Maybe you could play Kamala in the debate since you've been on the stage with her. Tom Del Beccaro is my guest, by the way, folks. He once ran the Republican Party in California. He was the U.S. Republican Senate candidate against Kamala Harris, and so he debated her on the stage and wiped her out, at least in terms of the debate. But of course, because it's such a liberal state, she triumphed in the race. But I want to talk about your new book, Tom, because this comes out. When does it come out? I think you said Tuesday.
Tuesday the 30th.
And so what made you decide to do this? It's called The Lessons of the American Civilization. What does that even mean?
Well, my whole career has been trying to get people to place moments in time and historical context so they can see where civilizations in the past have dealt with issues and how we can learn from our past. I mean, we live our life based on experience. Hopefully we don't make the same mistake every day that we wake up. We rely on experience, whether it's economic policy, whether it's family policy, all these things we should take into account. So I always try and place things in historical context. I started, believe it or not, my parents started me reading history books and economic books at 10 years old. The Durants, who wrote The Story of Civilization, 9,700 pages, I started at 16. So this book has been in the works for decades. And
Wow.
what I wanted to do is get people to understand that great civilizations are born in faith, a faith in their purposes to why they exist for America, democratization and opportunity, but they decline in doubt. They doubt their basic purpose. They lose their religious beliefs. So I wanted to put America in context because people keep asking, what's happening in America today?
So that's a scary thing that you're saying, because you're right. We have lost our way as a country. I mean, you see that, for example, marriage rates are way down. You see that the number of Americans that are having children is down. You see that, especially in the Democratic Party, there is not a lot of patriotism. They don't feel that America is a special place, a shining city on a hill, as Reagan would say. And so we've been sliding in that direction. And I guess if I understand you correctly, that if we continue down that path, America's status as a superpower is in danger.
So I take up every one of those topics you just mentioned and many, many more. Chapter 10 is America, Capitalism, and Socialism, how we went from a capitalist society to being so open, if not having socialist policies.
Right.
But I'd never want people, as a historian, I never want people to get discouraged, because man is capable of improvement, and great men and women in history have changed the course of history.
That's true.
Right? Think of Washington laying his sword down and really creating modern republics by saying it's possible to give power back, right? And so, yes, we are showing signs of decline. We are showing a lack of faith. In the beginning, you have this public virtue, as Edward Gibbon would say, a belief in your country and doing things for the benefit of it. In decline, you tend to see people who, or as I say, at the beginning of a civilization, there's a competition for ideas. At the end, there's a competition for spoils, meaning people are just seeing what they can get out of. And one of the dangers of America, which I know you work against all the time, you know, Washington, D.C. is, and I hate using Washington's name in that, but is a big business, right? If they're making money, they want our money, but not our 2 cents. We've actually reached the point where government is trying to protect itself from us. And I talk about all of these things, and the great Dr. Arthur Laffer, who was kind enough to give me a quote, says that, basically says here, if I could just real quick say it, Delbacar's lessons show us how to break out of modern habits and resume our journey toward freedom, peace, and
I like that.
prosperity.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. And that's all the more reason to read this book, because we are on a bad path right now. But I also believe, it was Reagan who said it was divine providence that put America here as this beacon of freedom. Do you believe that?
I absolutely believe that. Just think about this. Think of all the great minds that came together in a very short period.
I know, it's amazing. It's the most amazing thing in history. I really think.
History, David Hume, John Locke, but they really weren't all in the same room. Yeah. You had 20, 30 people.
I know. It's incredible.
Brilliant minds. So is that providential? It's pretty darn close if it isn't.
It's funny you should mention that, because when you think about it, folks, 20 of the greatest people who ever walked on the planet, got together in one room, and, from Madison to Jefferson to Patrick Henry to, all of those, Hamilton.
Franklin.
it's mind-boggling that these great people could come together and write this document called the United States Constitution, and that it has become a playbook for how you survive as a nation and prosper. And I always say you probably couldn't find 20 people on the planet today that could match their wit and wisdom.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things they do, the second to last chapter, is the top 10 lessons of the American civilization. And I answer the question, is the United States exceptional or not? And when you do comparative history, the point is, well, compare America to others. The great Thomas Sowell, who's amazing, says, always ask compared to what? And if you look at the achievements of America decade by decade, century by century, and then compare them to the rest of the world, you come to the easy conclusion that America was exceptional, is exceptional, and can be exceptional going forward.
I love it. Tom Del Vaccaro is my guest. His book is The Lessons of the American Civilization. He debated Kamala Harris and defeated her in that debate in 2016. So Trump has to get together with you, Tom, so you can tell him how he can win his debate with her. Tom Del Vaccaro, thanks so much for joining, folks. This is the More Money Show on WABC Talk Radio, and we'll be right back. As if landlords can only get a certain amount for their apartments, guess what? They stop buying and stop building apartments. And so you get a reduction in the supply of the apartments, right? This is just basic economics. And so what you do is you put people out of homes. You can't find a rental apartment at any price when you put price controls. So you have an increase in homelessness, and you have an increase in shoddy upkeep of these rental units, because if you can't charge the proper rent, then you're going to not provide the services that go with having a house. So rent control, even my friends on the left agree, rent control is a terrible, terrible policy. Everybody knows it. Every economist knows it. And yet Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are in favor of rent control now. They think it's because of greedy landlords that rents are going up. No, the reason rents are going up is because Biden inflation. The same reason bread prices are going up, egg prices are going up. The same reason airline tickets are going up, because Joe Biden created the highest inflation tax rate we've had since Jimmy Carter was in office. Folks, I will now turn it over to Ryan and Bob Payne. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. And this is WABC Talk Radio.